Greetings! I'm Willy Wonka, and I'm excited today, my dear children, because today I'm going to be reading you, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Yeah, this will be a little series here on my YouTube channel, so make sure you're subscribed. We're going to be reading about 30 pages in every video, and there's about 150 pages in the book. Yeah, so make sure you subscribe and check out the merch using the link in the description. Here we go. This is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. Yeah, here we go. I hope you're excited, my dear children. I'm very sorry that you can't see some of the pictures. These two very old people are the father and the mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. Yeah. And these two very old people are the father and the mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. I do like Grandma Georgina very much, my dear children. This is Mr. Bucket, and this is Mrs. Bucket. And Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy, whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups and little Charlie Bucket, live together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. Now, my dear children, it is a very great town. It happens to be the town where I have my factory. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 grandparents because they were old and tired. They were so tired they never got out of bed. No. Grandpa George and Grandma Josephine on this side, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room, upon mattresses on the floor. Yeah. In the summertime this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house, or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory, where he sat all day on a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But the toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough money to buy 1/2 of the things that such a large family needed. Oh my goodness. There wasn't even enough money to buy a proper food for all of them. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup. Ew! Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 grandfathers, the 2 grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with the horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. And the one thing he longed for more than anything was chocolate. I don't blame you, Charlie, no. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see the great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass. His mouth was watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching on them greedily. And that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year, on his birthday, did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that one special occasion, and when that great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with 1 small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasure it, as although it was a bar of solid gold. For the next few days he would allow himself only to look at it, but to never touch it. Then at last, He could stand it no longer, and he would peel back the teeny bit of the paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate, and then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. That sounds delicious, my dear children. The next day he would take another nibble, and so on and so on. And this way Charlie could make his 10-cent bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. Oh my goodness. But I still haven't told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing the slabs of chocolate in the shop windows, or watching the other children munching creamy candy bars right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could ever imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. My dear children, it must have been my chocolate factory. Yeah, the largest chocolate factory in the world. Just imagine that. And it simply wasn't an ordinary, enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous factory in the whole world. Oh my goodness, I just said that, my dear children, I told you. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there ever has been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading to the front of it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange wheezing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls for half a mile in every direction, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. That's true, my dear children, it's very good, yeah. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory, and every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside that factory and see what it was like. Don't we all, Charlie? Oh, we're on chapter 2. It's titled Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. I like that. In the evenings after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the other room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. Oh my goodness. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled on their one bed, 2 at either end, with their nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing all the time away, with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening, and they heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe, and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, and their little old wrinkled faces would light right up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin, for they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well, and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, the room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True," cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little bit higher on his pillow, "Mr. Wonka is the most amazing and most fantastic and most extraordinary chocolate maker in the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." "Clever," cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads slowly, up and down, and said absolutely true, just as true as one can be. And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered Charlie. "Good heavens above, I don't know what's the matter with me." "Well, you need to tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please." "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anyone can be. Like all extremely old people, he was very delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed to be in some marvelous way to grow to be quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka," cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything any other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine, "and he sends them to all the 4 corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is. And to all the kings and the presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh dear me, no. He really has some fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without ever being in the icebox?" "That's true, my dear children, I did do that." "You can eat it lying around in the sun all morning on a hot day, and it won't go runny." "But that's impossible," said Charlie, staring at his grandfather. "Of course it's impossible," said Grandpa Joe. "It's completely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it." "Quite right," the others agreed, nodding their heads. "Mr. Wonka has done it." And then again, Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now, so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. "Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste like violets, and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them in between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and candy balloons that you can blow up into enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by the most secret method, he can make lovely blue bird eggs with little spots on them, and when you put one of those in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue." Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. "It makes my mouth water just thinking about it," he said. "Mine too," said little Charlie. "But please, go on." While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and were both now standing just inside the door, listening. "Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince," said Grandma Josephine. "He'd like to hear that." "You mean Prince Pondicherry?" "I don't know how to say that, my dear children, I'm very sorry," said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. "Completely, Dottie," said Grandpa George. "But very rich," said Grandma Georgina. "What did he do?" asked Charlie eagerly. "Listen," said Grandpa Joe, "and I'll tell you." Chapter 3, Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. This is a good story, my dear children. "Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka," said Grandpa Joe, "and he asked him to come all the way out to India to build him a colossal palace made entirely out of chocolate." "Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa?" "He did indeed, and what a palace it was. It had 100 rooms, and everything was made out of either dark or light chocolate. The bricks were made of chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and the walls and the ceilings were all made of chocolate. And the carpets were made of chocolate, and the furniture, and the pictures, and the beds, and when you turned on the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, 'I warn you though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away.' 'Nonsense,' shouted the prince. 'I'm not going to eat it at all. I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to take a nibble in the staircase, or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it.' But Mr. Wonka was right, and of course, because soon after this there was a very hot day with boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt, and then it sank slowly into the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in a huge brown sticky lake of chocolate. It sounds like fun to me, my dear children. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright, and his eyes were stretched so wide you could see the whites all around. "Is all this really true?" he asked. Or are you pulling my leg?" "It's true," cried all four of the grandparents at once. "Of course it's true. Ask anyone you'd like." "And I'll tell you something else that's true," said Grandpa Joe, and now he leaned closer to Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. "Nobody ever, ever comes out." "Out of where?" asked Charlie. "And nobody ever goes in." "In where?" cried Charlie. "Wonka's factory, of course." "Grandpa, what do you mean?" "I mean workers, Charlie." "Workers? Huh?" "All factories," said Grandpa Joe, "have workers streaming in and out of them, out of the gates in the mornings and the evenings, except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out?" Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the four old faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg pulling in any of them. "Well, have you?" asked Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa," Charlie stammered. Whenever I walked past the factory, the gates seemed to be closed." "Exactly," said Grandpa Joe, "but there must be people working there." "Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway." "Then who?" cried Charlie. "Aha! That's it. You see, there's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's cleverness." "Charlie, dear," Mrs. Bucket called out from where she was standing at the door, "it's time for bed. That's enough for tonight." "But, Mother, I must hear." "Tomorrow, my darling." "That's right," said Grandpa Joe, "and I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow evening." Yeah. Chapter 4, The Secret Workers. We all know what they're referring to, my dear children. It's my Oompa Loompas. The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with his story. "You see, Charlie," he said, "not so very long ago there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. Then one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home, and never come back." "But why?" asked Charlie. "Because of the spies." "Spies?" "Yes. All the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful candies that Mr. Wonka was making, and they started sending in spies to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending that they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a certain special thing was made. I hate those despicable spies." "And did they go back to their own factories and tell?" asked Charlie. "They must have," answered Grandpa Joe, "because soon after that, Fickelgerber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, even in the hottest sun. Then Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavor, however much you chewed it. And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began selling candy balloons that you could blow up to the huge sizes before you popped them with a pin and gobbled them up. And so on and so on. And Mr. Willy Wonka tore his beard and shouted, 'This is terrible. I shall be ruined. There are spies everywhere. I shall have to close the factory.'" "But he didn't do that," Charlie said. "Oh, yes, he did. He told all the workers that he was sorry, that they would have to go home, and then he shut the main gates and fastened them with a chain, and suddenly Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted, and the chimney stopped smoking, and the machine stopped whirling, and from then on, not a single chocolate or candy was made, not a soul went in or out, and even Mr. Willy Wonka himself disappeared completely." "Months and months went by," Grandpa Joe went on, "but still the factory remained closed, and everybody said, 'Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice.'" "Thank you." "And he made such marvelous things, but he's finished now. It's all over." Then something astonishing happened. One day early in the morning, thin columns of white smoke were seen coming out of the tops of all the tall chimneys of the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. "What's going on?" they cried. "Someone's lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again." They ran to the gates, expecting to see them wide open, and Mr. Wonka standing there to welcome his workers back. But no, the gray iron gates were still locked and chained as securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. "But the factory is working," the people shouted. "Listen, you can hear the machines. They're all whirling again, and you can smell the smell of melting chocolate in the air." Grandpa Joe leaned forward and laid a long, bony finger on Charlie's knee and said softly, "But most mysterious of all, Charlie, were the shadows in the windows of the factory. The people standing on the street outside could see small dark shadows moving around behind the frosted glass windows. Shadows of whom? Charlie said quickly. That's exactly what everyone else wanted to know. The place is full of workers, the people shouted, but nobody's gone in. The gates are locked. It's crazy. Nobody ever comes out either. But there was no question at all, said Grandpa Joe, that the factory was running, and it has gone on running ever since, for the last 10 years. What's more, the chocolates and candies it's been turning out have become even more fantastic and delicious all the time. And of course now, when Mr. Wonka invents some new and wonderful candy, neither Fickle Gerber, nor Mr. Prodnose, nor Mr. Slugworth, nor anybody else is able to copy it. No spies can get into the factory to find out how it was made. But Grandpa, who, cried Charlie, who is Mr. Wonka using to do all the work in the factory? Nobody knows, Charlie. But that's absurd. Hasn't someone asked Mr. Wonka? Nobody sees him anymore. He never comes out. The only things that come out of that place are chocolates and candies. They come out through a special trap door in the wall, all packed and addressed, and they are picked up every day by post office trucks. But Grandpa, what sort of people are they that work in there? My dear boy, said Grandpa Joe, that is one of the great mysteries of the chocolate-making world. We know only one thing about them. They are very small. The faint shadows that sometimes appear behind the windows, especially late at night when the lights are on, and those tiny people no taller than my knee. There aren't any such people, said Charlie. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory, and he was waving an evening newspaper rather excitedly. Have you heard the news? He cried. He held up the paper so that they all could see the huge headline. The headline said, Wonka Factory to be opened at last to a lucky few. Yeah. Welcome to Chapter 5, my dear children. It's titled The Golden Tickets. Really exciting, yeah. You mean people are actually going to be allowed to go inside the factory? Cried Grandpa Joe. Read us what it says, quickly. All right, said Mr. Bucket, smoothing out the newspaper. Listen. Mr. Willy Wonka, the candy-making genius, whom nobody has seen in the last 10 years, has sent out the following notice today. I, Willy Wonka, have decided to allow 5 children, just 5, mind you, and no more, to visit my factory this year. These lucky 5 will be shown around personally by me, and they will be allowed to see all the secrets and the magic of my factory. Then, at the end of the tour, as a special present, all of them will be given enough chocolates and candies to last them the rest of their lives. So watch out for the golden tickets. 5 golden tickets have been printed out on golden paper, and these 5 golden tickets have been hidden underneath the ordinary wrapping paper of 5 ordinary candy bars. These 5 candy bars may be anywhere, in any shop, in every street, in any town, in any country in the world, upon any counter where Wonka's candies are sold. And the 5 lucky finders of these golden tickets are the only ones who will be allowed to visit my factory and see what it's like now on the inside. Good luck to you all, and happy hunting. Signed, Willy Wonka. The man's dotty, muttered Grandma Josephine. He's brilliant, cried Grandpa Joe. He's a magician. Just imagine what will happen now. The whole world will be searching for those golden tickets. Everyone will be buying Wonka's candy bars in the hope of finding one. He'll sell more now than ever. Oh, how exciting it would be to find one. And all the chocolate and the candies you could eat for the rest of your life? Free? Cried Grandpa George. Just imagine that. They'd have to deliver them in a truck, said Grandma Georgina. It makes me quite ill to think of all of it, said Grandma Josephine. Nonsense, cried Grandpa Joe. Wouldn't it be something, Charlie, to open a bar of candy and see a golden ticket glistening inside? It certainly would, Grandpa, but there isn't hope, said Charlie. I only get 1 bar a year. You never know, darling, said Grandma Georgina. It's your birthday next week. You have as much chance as anybody else. I'm afraid that simply isn't true, said Grandpa George. The kids who are going to find the golden tickets are the ones who can afford to buy candy bars every day. Our Charlie only gets 1 a year. There isn't any hope. All right, my dear children, that's all we're going to read for today. Yeah, we're on Chapter 6, so stay tuned for the next part to come out very soon. And don't forget to subscribe, my dear children, and if you stuck around to the very end, I can tell you that you're a good nut. Yeah. Have a good day. Huh?